Welcome to the 13th Annual Digital Education Summit. This year's summit is designed to share how our faculty use best practices in online instruction to connect with their students. This year's Digital Education Summit features more than 30 sessions led by faculty and staff from Sam Houston State University and other educational professionals from around the nation and the world, all committed to sharing innovative, exciting, and practical pedagogical strategies. We appreciate the participation and insights of everyone attending this year's event. Together, we will explore the evolving world of online education, discovering the tools we will need to meet the challenges of today and in the years to come.
Welcome, colleagues. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Phil Hill. Phil is a leading voice in the area of educational technology, and his work has been instrumental in shaping the future of digital education. As the publisher of the On EdTech blog and the principal at Phil Hill & Associates, Phil has dedicated his career to analyzing and interpreting the dynamic growth of technology in education. His insights have not only uncovered significant trends, but have also provided critical guidance on their broader implications. Phil's expertise extends to advising a diverse range of clients, from universities as different as Western Governors and Iowa State to major corporations like Pearson Education and Cisco Systems. His consultancy has influenced pivotal decisions and strategies. His extensive experience also includes writing for EDUCAUSE Review, Inside Higher Ed, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. And Phil's been quoted by major media outlets, including National Public Radio and the New York Times. In today's keynote address, Phil will delve into the transformative power of accessibility and open educational resources. He will explore how these elements are not just enhancements, but essential components that can redefine digital education. By sharing best practices for integrating OER and creating inclusive spaces, Phil will offer valuable insights into how these strategies can significantly improve educational access and foster a more engaging, supportive learning environment. Please join me in welcoming Phil Hill.
Hello, and thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really looking forward to the session today. I will note that I am doing this session from Raleigh, North Carolina, visiting my sister and my mom where they live, and we're right where the outer edge of Tropical Storm Helene is about to hit any minute. So here's hoping that the power is going to work today. So part of what we want to talk about is, there is a lot of innovation that's possible, and we want to get to that. And that includes a rethinking somewhat of OER, an opportunity to rethink that. But we have to acknowledge that we're doing this in a very challenging time frame. So I'm going to start out the session actually on a low note, talking about the challenges that we face, and then transition into talking about where there is a good set of opportunities for innovation, particularly around digital education, helping students through their educational journey. I will say also, this is not the first time that I have been part of the Digital Education Summit. So 2 years ago, I was fortunate enough to participate with the keynote then as well. And at the time, we had just had some of the release of the image production generative AI that had come out, DALL-E, Midjourney, etc. And one thing I do remember from the session that I enjoyed, this is part of what makes it so good from an interactive standpoint, is somebody, while I was talking, and I happened to be working from a hotel room in London on a business trip, but somebody came up with an image of me presenting on a keyboard or on a laptop from London in the hotel room. And so that's what you're seeing on the left. Now, it definitely got my hairstyle. I'm not quite sure why I'm wearing sunglasses in a hotel room and a bathrobe to give a keynote. But otherwise, it was a lot of fun. I can't remember who did that, if that was JT or not. But in any case, that was fun 2 years ago. Things have changed significantly since then. And so I did a similar view on the right using Grok from X. And a couple things you'll notice is the photorealism is just striking what you can do today, just from a short prompt. I think they got my beard right, but I'm a little bit insulted that Grok does not know who I am, so did not grab an accurate image. But it did choose to make me quite young and give me a full hairline, which I haven't had for years. So I enjoyed that. But things have changed quite a bit just in the past 2 years, and you can get some of a sense from this. Now, this is ed tech, so we're going to be coming back to generative AI later in the session, but I just wanted to set the stage and appreciate that I've been able to work with you guys twice now. It's a great conference, great summit, and great opportunity. So let's take a look at where we are. And I worked on a graphic. Well, I have the ideas, but I have a graphics guy who comes up with it. But it was looking at the enrollment environment because enrollments drive institutional health in so many cases. Put another way, I might not show this for the Harvard Digital Education Summit, but for the majority of the country, this is very relevant, looking at enrollment. And you have a very mixed picture. Um, we have a lot of turbulence that's going on right now, but that doesn't mean everything is bad. You have tailwinds, you have headwinds, and you have mistakes being made. A lot of these are mega trends. It's hard to deal with. But this is sort of the world that I think so much of us live in, is dealing with this turbulence, in particular as it hits enrollments. But then what is happening? So not everything's bad, as I mentioned. One thing to notice is we have lifelong learning. There's a very big shift going on away from just the traditional view of an 18 to 24-year-old student getting a degree, then getting into the workforce and they're done, one and done type of degree. We have much more vibrant area, largely thanks to online education, but for other reasons as well. It's getting more into people extending their education journey throughout their life. So it might be studying something that has nothing to do with their job. It might be getting certificates and learning a new skill. Glenda Morgan, my colleague who helps write on EdTech newsletter, is taking one right now about generative AI with data analysis because she's very interested in data, but she's definitely not a Tableau expert or with the skill set. You have other people who are trying to upskill and trying to say, I want to advance my career. And a lot of times you have companies, employers paying for this type of lifelong learning, employee tuition benefits and stuff like that. But this is a major trend, and it really opens up the population that's available for education and that can be part of the educational mission. Another tailwind worth mentioning is the preference for colleges and universities. You hear way too much these days, in my opinion, about is college worth it? Is it worth the investment? There's just some more analysis from New America this week, but I see it, at least every few weeks, a study on this level. And there is some truth that there's some change there, but it's also very consistent that I've seen that higher education gets sort of the right of first refusal on new ideas. So take some degree certificates or, certificates not even tied to a degree. You can get that from a different type of provider. One of the headwinds is alternative learning providers. It might be a Coursera, something that's happening outside of the immediate area for colleges and universities. And there's no reason you have to use your college and universities. But the surveys that you look at, employers in particular, but also learners, they would prefer that colleges and universities are the ones who provide additional credentials. It's built up a trusted place in our society. And yes, we have problems today, but there's still a desire by the population, employers, learners, et cetera, policymakers, for the right of first refusal. So you have these tailwinds pushing things along. Now, on the negative side, and this gets to our challenging time frame, you have student debt. There's no denying that the amount of student debt that's getting somewhat close to $2 trillion in the US for higher education, with a significant percentage of students who are not making progress on paying off their debt, is a major problem. And it's a problem for students just in terms of policy and what's good for our society. But it's also now getting to the front of mind of students and potential students when they're deciding whether to go to college and which college to go to and which program makes sense. Now, while this is a headwind, I mean, I actually think that's something of a good thing that they're better educated consumers, if you will, of education. But it's definitely pushing back and causing problems on the enrollment side. Another area that's hitting is the demographic cliff, which was popularized by Nathan Graw several years ago. I personally don't think that it's a cliff, it's a hill, but it's real. And it's basically a change in the number of entering college students of age to be entering for first time enrollment. And that's essentially going to peak in the US in 2026 and then drop for at least 5 years. And that is going to be a very big challenge. And note that we're just about to hit this area. It hasn't really hit in force. In some areas, I think, some regions it has. But this demographic cliff is definitely going to be a problem. Scott Jeffrey over at Ruffalo Noel Levitz just put out a couple of posts recently where he was saying if you look at what's happening, there's actually two demographic cliffs that are happening. You have the one starting in 2026, roughly, that's going to drop the number of 18-year-olds in first year enrollments by a couple 100,000 students just within roughly a 5-year period. And this is based on the number of 18-year-olds are going to be, but also based on how likely is that mix of students to go to college. What you see in this is actually very relevant, and I'm not seeing it discussed much lately. If you look at the small dotted line, the projections from the Census Bureau as of 2017 showed that there was somewhat of a recovery starting in the early 2030s and going up. So that you had the cliff was the left oval, if you will. What Scott is showing is if you look at the updated Census Bureau information, there's actually a second cliff that's going to be happening in the early 2030s and then sort of a leveling out. What that basically means is we're talking at least 10 years of a challenging enrollment environment that's going to be happening. And this impacts what we can do. It impacts finances. Since we're talking about innovation, innovation takes time, it takes money. And this makes the world challenging. It makes institutions tough on being able to staff. So that's going to continue. Another one is we talked about inflation and interest rates. So basically, in 2022, we started to have pretty significant inflation. One of the things that did is it led to a complete change in interest rates, which gets to the cost of borrowing and the cost, and that's for vendors, investors. It gets to higher education institutions. And it goes beyond interest rates, but you have things such as the cost per employee, the cost for your electric bills. Institutions have a challenging time. In terms of innovation, what this chart shows, it's from Hull and IQ, and they're showing investment, venture capital investment. So this is typically where you get funding for new ideas, new companies, new technologies being developed. And outside of AI, generative AI, there's almost nothing. You see in the United States that VC investment in education was going up steadily, but then it really jumped with the pandemic with a huge peak in 2021. Unfortunately, this was too much irrational exuberance because a lot of people looked at what was happening, and And you got a lot of what I would say drive-by investors, people who weren't used to the education space, but suddenly investing in education. And you even see Tom Brady investing in some companies. Sorry for picking on him. But what happened is there were some really bad assumptions, such as people looked at Zoom and said, hey, this is the way for education. We don't need to go back, not recognizing that not all students want a virtual environment. A lot of students wanted to go back to the face to face environment. So a Zoom concept just got way overinflated in terms of valuation. Now, that's a publicly traded company, but take that idea and look at all the ed tech startups that were based on similar type of changes. Everything changes with COVID, and we're going to keep going up. That's why you see that spike in 2021. That's when there were so many investors. 2022 hits, and there's still some residual excitement, but part of what people are happening, two things happen. One is a realization that, hey, not everything in education has changed. There's going to be a pullback from the pandemic and reintroduction of so much more face to face and even traditional methods of education. Certainly, it went up from what it was before, but it's not going to stay at 2021 levels. So, investors started to realize that. The second thing was because of interest rates, within a 6-month period, investors at large changed their primary focus. It used to be, I want growth, I want opportunity, I want to see where technology, ed tech, can take us into the future. And within a 6-month period, it suddenly changed to, I need you to be profitable. So the primary metric for a company was, how can you turn a profit, at least be break even and not require additional investments to move forward? This put a huge strain on ed tech. This is why you're seeing such huge layoffs happening across the technology space. It's why you're seeing 2U go bankrupt as the largest, the most high profile online program management company. They actually exited bankruptcy, but it was caused by this interest rate and the change in investment mentality. So this overall area, it also impacts the cost of schools doing their operations. But net effect is that's one of the major headwinds that we're dealing with in this space. Now, while we're going through this difficult time, we also have the Department of Education and its activist allies just making it much, much more difficult to operate in the space. Um, they're looking at online education, and there's the whole mentality of the department seems to have changed from one of, and I'm not trying to idealize the past, but there was much more of a mix of consumer protection, but along with how do you encourage educational concepts? How do you encourage innovation? How do we do best for students? At this point, the department has almost become a consumer protection bureau where the whole idea is who's ripping off students and how do we catch the bad actors and how do we hold them accountable? Like that's the primary job right now. What that does is it makes it difficult difficult for higher education institutions to operate, particularly in terms of online courses and other digital education areas. And one of the things, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, is the new pending, it hasn't been finalized, proposal to require attendance taking for all online courses, which, and I have a whole article a couple articles, will make it very difficult or make it to use multiple applications to serve a student within one course. It's going to be a natural push to do everything within the LMS or, try to not innovate too much. So this is what I mean by a lot of this regulatory activism is really harming innovation. You also have the FAFSA fiasco, which enough said for that, at least for today. Now, higher education has also been causing some of its own problems, and this is the Boeing jetliner. You see the door falling off from high tuition, from a loss of mission and forgetting where, what education is about. And there's an ongoing question about how much of this is for getting a job. and paying off your education versus educating the whole student and the societal benefit. And I realize both of those are very important, but the point is, I think there's sort of a loss of mission that's also going on at this stage. So this is my pretty depressing setup for the keynote as we talk about innovation. This is the time that we live in, particularly in U.S. higher education. We have all of these forces going on. So then I guess it raises the question, or at least why am I somewhat optimistic about the opportunity for innovation, for access, for helping students out? So, how do we get to that mentality while acknowledging the difficult time period that we're living in? Well, one way to view this is the Satir change model. And Virginia Satir, she was a family therapist, so not technology, but a lot of her ideas about therapy for individuals and groups have been sort of translated into a technology perspective, primarily by Jerry Weinberg, who wrote The Psychology of the Computer Programmer and really introduced the human ideas behind technology, how much human issues do that. But this model to me really helps explain a lot of what we're seeing. And the change model is basically the performance, whatever you're trying to achieve. And so, if a family is one thing, but if you're trying to look at this as like a university or higher education at large, educating students and how effective you are, that's the performance in the vertical axis. And you tend to have a status quo. And at some point, you have a foreign element that's thrown in there, changing things. One example I've described this as is the MOOCs from more than a decade ago. That suddenly got college presidents across the system, not just at regionals, not just in certain areas, suddenly saying we've got to do something about online education. Harvard and MIT and Stanford started investing massively in there. Now it was overhyped, and you get resistance. So there was a lot of resistance to the idea of MOOCs. And if you look at it, you start getting wild fluctuations in the performance, and things get a little bit chaotic. And then you get into full chaos at a certain point. And then, not every case, but eventually, the best thing that can happen is you have a transforming idea. Here's how this concept can help us out. Once that transforming idea gets in place, you can start integrating it within education, in our case, and you start getting the improved performance that you were hoping to get in the beginning. And then eventually you get to a new status quo, ideally at a much higher level of performance. This is key here. The foreign element is almost never the same thing as the transforming idea. Occasionally, but very rarely. So, for example, the MOOC itself didn't change education. Udacity didn't become one of 10 higher education institutions, everybody else going out of business. It didn't replace universities. But what it did is it got all institutions asking, what should we be doing with online and virtual education? How should we be investing? It was no longer relegated to the for-profit institutions or to the continuing education department. It really got it into the mainstream. And now, if you look at what's happening within education, it's permeated the system, and it's changing the view. So part of why that's important is this chart looks at the percentage of enrollment of students taking at least one online course. So that includes a distance education program or students who are face-to-face, but one of their courses is online. And over time, the orange line, which is essentially students saying, no, I don't do any online, that's been steadily going down for a decade. And then the green line is where the number of students, and also, if you think about it, the number of faculty who have been involved in some pretty intense digital education has been steadily rising. Well, when COVID hit, obviously you had a spike in the green and the orange went down, but then you pulled back, but we've pulled back to the point that's higher than it was before. Here's where it's relevant is the fact that we're now in a place where the majority of faculty members have some direct experience with digital education. We're not in the area 10 years ago where the majority talked about things and they might be resistant to change, but quite often they had no experience in it. Now, thanks to COVID, even if you didn't like Zoom University or whatever your experience was, people have experience, and now faculty members in particular, but also broader than that, have experience and say, hey, I like this, I didn't like this, I want to do things differently. And that's where there's a lot of opportunity, is taking advantage of this frustration based on experience where people want to improve how they do teaching and learning and benefit from digital education. So this is a large opportunity, and it also impacts students. So this is from a recent survey. Let me take a step back. For the longest time, we've looked at online education. It almost became an asynchronous is the way to go. Students want to be anywhere, anytime. They're working adults, and the assumption of we don't want to have any synchronous sessions. Because I might be doing it at midnight, I might be doing it a different schedule. And that's very important. But I think we got locked into this mentality of the proper way, outside of COVID, the proper way to do online education was fully asynchronous. Now, the Achilles heel, not just of online, but of digital education in general, in my opinion, is student engagement. The opportunity to engage with other humans in particular, with their faculty, with support staff, with their peer students. And it's been very difficult to do that. And I think we've somewhat locked ourselves into what the options are for making these changes, saying it's got to be fully asynchronous in way too many cases. And people say, well, that's what students want. Well, this is from a survey. The Voice of the Online Learner used to be the Learning House survey, sponsored it. But so it's been running for years. But they looked at which students, both current students and prospective students, if you're in an asynchronous class, would you be willing to have some synchronous sessions? And if you look at this, the numbers are actually quite extraordinary, if you ask me, and against what people assume. Let me just summarize it in my words. Nearly 90% of prospective online students are willing to have synchronous meetings in their otherwise asynchronous courses. So we're not talking about let's make everything lecture-based and the Zoom University that we saw during COVID. What we're saying is, okay, it's mostly asynchronous to allow students flexibility, but can we have the opportunity to ask questions of faculty live, of doing group work where people are online at the same time interacting, which students have consistently given feedback that really helps increase their engagement. The answer prior to the past few years was no, that's not what they want. What I believe we're seeing is there's a new willingness to do this. And if you look at the reasons in the follow-up question, and it's in the blog post that's been linked, of why they would be willing, it's mature reasons. It's students saying, oh, it will help deepen my understanding by being able to interact with my faculty real time. It'll help me understand my peers and work with them in group work. Again, not to replace as a lecture, but the opportunity to enhance online courses with synchronous methods. So I'm not saying that's for everybody. What I am saying is this is another new opportunity for innovation in how we do digital education that might not have existed even 4 or 5 years ago. There's a willingness to explore how do you blend these methods together. So if you combine these, there's just, this is, again, because of this inflection point, because assumptions have changed, we happen to be in an area where there's a lot of new things we can do that we couldn't do before. Now, that doesn't include relying on VCs to create new companies out of whole cloth and brand new technologies, and that's where the innovation happens, and we just have to license it. That's not happening right now very much, but there are a lot of opportunities that you can innovate. Now, generative AI is obviously all the talk, and there's a lot of opportunities here. I will point out this is from my colleague Glenda Morgan's article. She talked about the 5 pathologies on how we react to these ideas. And in higher education, you tend to go, there's too much trendiness, exaggerated results, solutionism, yeah, and even moral panics. Now, none of this is to dismiss the negatives of generative AI. There are real privacy issues, there's quality issues, there's a lot that we have to deal with. But so much of the talk in higher education circles in the initial year or two of generative AI have been based on these um, non-productive discussions without really getting into what's possible and how can we rethink what's happening. It really is something different, but we have to think about what it could be in the future. One way to look at this is David Wiley had a fascinating keynote that he did, and I have that in the links, which I know will be popping up. And David Wiley is essentially, I consider him the father of open educational resources. He really was leading this concept along with others, but from the late 1990s. He's known very much for the 5 R's on how to understand OER, getting into remix, reuse, and these concepts. And so he has been Mr. OER so far. His keynote and 2 articles that go along with it, he's changed his perspective. He said, not that OER doesn't matter. He said, we've got to move from traditional OER to generative OER. And so he's thinking the definition of OERs in the future will be much more wrapped around generative AI. I can't replace his whole keynote, but I think it's significant. He mentioned the Drake equation, and that's essentially saying what is the possibility of life outside of intelligent life outside of Earth? And it goes through a series of looks about, is there a planet or something that has the conditions that are ripe for life? Are there any, what's the geology there? And it's got a series of things that sort of cut down the possibility. You have to have this, you have to have this, you have to have this. So it's sort of a series of gates, if you will. And that's what the Drake equation does. He applied that to OER. He said, listen, if you think about the Drake equation of OER, you need a resource for a specific topic in a specific course. To make that work with traditional OER, first, you have to hope that someone else somewhere has already created the resource. Then you have to hope that they've openly licensed it. Then you have to hope that they published it where you can Google or find it. It's in a repository, has the metadata. Then that there were several other things he was pointing out. So traditional OER is held up by these barriers. And the difference is with generative AI, if you think about that from an open educational resource, you describe it, what you need, and then it creates it on the spot for what you need. And it gets rid of so many of these barriers. He mentioned one, if you look at the generation of the OER, like a textbook that's OER, like OpenStax, that might cost $1 million to develop. And it has a very similar process to publisher provided textbooks, but it's openly licensed. With generative AR, it gets much closer to the usage of the individual instructor and the real-time need and the customized need that they actually have to do this. So that's where David, which is quite significant, is making this argument. Now, part of the openness as we get into generative AR is he's talking about why open prompts matter. So, If you take this argument, part of the thing that you can do is generative AI will help create the content, but the prompts you put in to help create that content, those need to be licensed in a way that they can be shared. So we really need to start focusing on sharing prompts and why that can be used. I would argue, and I'll get into this in just a little bit, it's not just the prompts, it's also the instructions to the large language model that's happening. But the net effect is he's rethinking things. And his big argument is fall in love with your problem, not your solution. So in the OER case, the problem is he defines it and somebody else in that community is saying it's increasing access to educational opportunities, regardless of income, et cetera. And you getting away from the thing, I can't afford the textbook, so I don't get it as a student, or I don't get it until a couple of weeks in, et cetera. That's the problem. That's what you should fall in love with and always want to deal with it. The solution, and it's been very valuable for the past 2 decades, has been traditional OER as a major component to it. But David's saying, don't fall in love with that because you will limit yourself. And we have new opportunities now to say, how can we apply generative AI to help rethink what OER could be and how that can apply to solving the core problem? You just have to let go of your previous assumptions, if you will, and don't fall in love with what you've been doing over the past 1 to 2 decades. It was such an important keynote in my mind, and I highly recommend, if you have time, if you're interested in that, to go watch the full keynote and to read the post that he has. But again, looking at it, where we're at is we are in a transformative moment. The generative AI really is something different. Most people classify it on the order of the introduction of the internet. Which, by the way, if you go back and look at history, the internet didn't roll out smoothly. You had a lot of bankruptcies. You had a lot of companies that overbuilt and didn't work well. And you had a lot of ideas, pets.com, Webvan, stuff like that came and went. Generative AI is going to have similar things where the initial ideas, right now, it's all about the chatbot. You have huge companies developing these huge large language models. Not all of these are going to work out, and I'd be surprised if we don't see some major bankruptcies or some sort of financial problem. And you're going to see a lot of ideas that come and go. Now, having said that, there's a transformative potential. So again, we're in this inflection point, new ideas from students and teachers, and new technology, particularly generative AI and the ability to link it to OER that's now hitting. And this is one of the opportunities to innovate. And again, not innovate in terms of let's rely on just a company doing it, but applying these ideas in new ways. That's where we're at. One area, and I'd like to get a little bit deeper into AI, and I don't want to imply that's the only innovation possible, but it is the topic du jour, is I don't think we've spent enough time looking at customized AI from projects within Claude, for example, or custom GPTs within ChatGPT. Those are 2 examples, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And these are essentially where it's not just how you write the prompt, but it's also how do you give instructions on which knowledge base to use for and tell the large language model what to do. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there that has not been fully explored, but it's available as a consumer for this. By the way, I do see questions coming in. There are links for the keynote, for David Wiley's keynote, that are on there, and the slides for this presentation will be available, just to note. So let's look at one thing, how this might work. And I use a personal example. When I was flying out to North Carolina, I went, let me do a share screen, and let me do Claude. And so what I did is I wanted to create one of these custom AIs, if you will. So, and that's not recreating a large language model, it's taking it and fine tuning it for a specific knowledge set that really changes the opportunity to define what's the answer going to be. So let's just take this as an example. What is put in a question here under Claude? What's the largest university in terms of online enrollments in the US? And this is a generic Claude answer. And it's not too bad. It's saying Southern New Hampshire has the largest enrollments. It's got 165,000 online students, which is not quite right. But then they notice Western Governors. They mentioned some others. So it's not bad, if you will. What I did is I took the our newsletter and the coverage we've done it on EdTech and sent that up to both Claude and ChatGPT as a knowledge base and said, now work directly off of this customized thing. And just to give you an idea, it took me 2 days to do this personally. And that included half of the work happening on an airplane flying to the East Coast. All right, so now I'm doing Claude again, but I'm doing it with this customized development based on my newsletter and the stuff we've done. Now, if we ask the exact same question in terms of what's the largest university in terms of online enrollments in the US, you'll see a different answer. Now you'll say, oh, the right way to do that is 12-month unduplicated headcount. Southern New Hampshire has got 251,000. Western Governors has 237,000, and it mentions some others. And those interested in more details can read the full analysis, and it could link to the post that we have showing that data. And let me just give you an idea of what we're looking at. So if I'm going to switch over to the post, this is the post that some of that data came from, and this was written and Claude went through it. And if you look at the data, you'll see it had this table listing Southern New Hampshire at 251,000, Western Governors, 237,000, and other details. And it's got some additional data that's in there. What's significant here is Claude, with this project, is now basing its knowledge off of something that I've been able to define. And that cuts down on a lot of the hallucinations and making things up. And it can benefit from the analysis that Glenda Morgan and I have already done. So so to make this happen, I'll show a little bit. Let's see, hold on a second. So to make this happen, here is the prompt that I use for both of them. Or not the prompt, the instructions. I told the large language model, you will always analyze this document from, you're going to only refer to the files that I uploaded and don't use your own internal. So don't go off just pulling in facts. Go with what I tell you first. Then answer it. I even told you how to answer it. Give a headline, 2 or 3 sentences, some details, etc. And so I tried to present that as a method for doing it. Think of this in terms of if you're an academic department and you build up your various faculty research, the course materials, or maybe it's individual faculty, you would have a very rich source of information that you could leverage the commercial development of ChatGPTs to go do this same work. And this, like I'm sharing right here, is that's a good way to think of what David Wiley was saying of OER. Share the prompt, share the instructions, and allow people to create things on the spot. Let me do one other example. And since it just came out this week, might as well give this a try. And I hope this works, but I'm going to ChatGPT and I'm going to select the on EdTech analysis, and I'm going to do the advanced audio mode. Looks like other people are doing. Which group is the primary funder of the regulatory activity that is targeting online program management companies? Going a little bit slow. I figured this would break down. So let me actually try to. Well, the thing that here, let me actually share a screen. It did put it within Chat GPT, but for some reason it didn't do the audio. Chat GPT share, and if you look at OnEd Tech Analysis, and then if you rephrase. All right. So this was the answer. I'm sorry that I didn't read it back audio wise. It said Arnold Ventures is a primary group that's funding this effort. My point is not the regulation here. My point is that Glenda Morgan and I are the primary, really the only people I know of, to be quite honest, who's done a deep dive into who's funding all these different regulatory efforts and showing that it is Arnold Ventures. If you ask ChatGPT a generic question, I often found it would say the Gates Foundation, and it's not funding these areas. Or it mentioned the Century Foundation, which does a lot of work, but it's not the one doing funding. So my point here is the fact that there's a lot of capability to do pretty quick innovations based on academics and what faculty and departments already have available for them. So where does that put us? Where that puts us is, and by the way, I'm going to in the breakout session after this, it's gonna be much more interactive. If people have questions about it, we can go through it. Just to sort of wrap up where we are, there's plenty of innovation in ed tech that's possible. It's just not based on massive VC investment in technology startups and not without risk. And the future is often defined during inflection points. And with COVID and with generative AI, there's a whole new set of possibilities right now. And to keep going back to David Wiley's to Keynote, that's a great example of how we can rethink problems and what we might be able to solve. But we don't fall in love with previous solutions. Fall in love with the problem, fall in love with what the possibilities are. And there's a lot of lower cost, quicker innovations that are now available to us. And I think there's also a lot of, we tried this innovation and it worked in a limited subset, and now we want to apply it to a broader group. So despite our challenging time frame, there's a lot of opportunity for innovation that is available to us. And I really encourage people during the summit to be thinking about what can we do? How can we push ourselves? And it's a great opportunity for having these discussions. But with that in mind, I'd like to thank you, everybody, for this. And as I said, there will be a follow-up session where I can address a lot of questions, Q&A, and go into more depth for people who do want to explore these topics. But let me turn it back over to you, JT.
Thank you very much, Phil. First of all, thank you so much for being here. It has been an absolute pleasure having you as our keynote speaker again. So thank you for that. For those watching at home, stick around. We still have plenty of sessions left in the day. And starting off with this one at DES 24, including another session right after this with Mr. Phil Hill to kind of expand on this keynote presentation. Once again, all of these sessions are being recorded. So if you missed a part of this, or if you want to see this session again, all of these are being recorded. You'll be able to view them afterwards or at any time during the day. Once again, thank you all for joining us for our keynote presentation with Mr. Phil Hill. And Phil, stay safe and dry over there. I know.
Yeah, the rain is just starting, so it's actually worked out well so far.
Perfect timing on our part. And to everyone else, you also stay safe and dry. And until next time, see you guys later. Phil, any final words?
No, just encourage you, do what you're doing during this summit. Talk to each other, share ideas. This is a great opportunity.